Hi there. My clock says it's 2:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Trahan. I am Deputy Director of CPWR, and I want to thank everyone who's tuned in for attending our webinar today on understanding and implementing the new construction Silica standard. To get started, I wanted to let folks know if you have any technical difficulties with the webinar or phone system, please contact Jessica Bunting by responding to the confirmation or reminder email that you used to join today's event, or emailing jbunting@cpwr.com. That's jbunting@cpwr.com. If you're listening to the audio portion through your computer and experience any lag or difficulty hearing the speakers, we recommend that you use your phone to call in for improved sound quality. You can switch your audio connection from the computer to the phone by clicking on the small phone icon beneath the participant list on the right side of your screen. We will take some time at the end of this presentation to answer questions, and depending upon the number of questions, our speakers are willing to go beyond 3 p.m. Eastern, so please stay tuned. If you have questions, it would be great if you would send them to me via chat. That's to Chris Trahan or Jessica Bunting, or just type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And Jessica, I was wondering if you would type in the public Q&A just an abbreviated instruction for folks who may have audio difficulties listening through the computer and how to click on that icon. And with that, we'll get started. So today, our webinar on understanding and implementing the new construction Silica standard will be presented by myself, Chris Trahan with CPWR, David O'Connor, who's with OSHA, and Eileen Betit, who is CPWR's Director of Research to Practice. We're going to go through this during this hour. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of CPWR's research program. David's going to cover an overview of the construction final rule. Eileen's going to cover the Silica Safe online tool to assist contractors in implementing the standard. And we'll have questions and answers at the end. And as I said, if you have questions along the way, just feel free to type them in, and we will go through them at the end of the presentation. A little bit about CPWR. We are a nonprofit organization that's been focusing on construction safety and health since 1990 through 3 major ways. We conduct research, applied research in construction safety and health. We conduct training throughout the country, and we offer medical screening programs to construction workers who are formerly employed in our nation's weapons complex through DOE. This is, again, is just a snapshot of our programs. They do all work together, and they are all designed for the construction industry to facilitate information from findings, for example, through our medical screening program, into our research and training programs, as well as information from the workers in the field from our training programs, feeding into both our research program and medical screening programs. And our research program is where our focus is for this webinar, and that program feeds both our screening programs as well as our training programs. And our research program, I'm not going to go through these 2 slides that I'm going to show you. You will be emailed a copy of this presentation after the webinar concludes. So I wanted just to give an idea of the breadth of our research. Here are listed 9 internal CPWR applied research programs that are funded through a cooperative agreement with NIOSH. You'll note Eileen Betit is listed here. She is our R2P director. And we also fund a group of universities around the country to conduct research programs with us, and we have 6 current multi-year cooperative agreement research programs in place in different university programs throughout the country. This is just a slide that shows some of our online resources. In the center is CPWR's main website. You can get to any of our web resources through cpwr.com, and I encourage folks to go and check out what we have available. One of our websites we're going to focus on in the third part of this presentation is our Work Safely with Silica site, or silicasafe.org. And with that, I wanted to introduce David O'Connor. David is the Director of the Office of Chemical Hazards, Non-Metals in the Directorate of Standards and Guidance at OSHA. He's worked on the development of standards and guidance with OSHA for 19 years, including projects on hexavalent chromium, hazard communication, bloodborne pathogens, and silica. He's what I consider the project officer for the development of the silica standard, and probably the best person who was able to join us for this presentation, knowing the rule better than anyone else. So with that, I'll turn it over to David, and thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, the final rule was published on March 25th, and it was a long time coming. It's something that the agency has been working on since the late 1990s. And after a long process involving public stakeholder meetings, consultation with small businesses, development of draft health, risk, economic, and technological feasibility analyses, a peer review, publication of the proposed rule, public comments and public hearings, the final rule was finally published. Now, OSHA has some good reasons for publishing that final rule. We have permissible exposure limits that the agency adopted in 1971, shortly after OSHA was created. But those are formulas, and anyone who has worked with them can understand how difficult they are and cumbersome they are to work with. They're formulas that many find difficult to understand. The construction and shipyard PELs are based upon a particle count sampling method that hasn't been used in decades. And there are differences between the requirements in different industries. The construction standard is actually 2.5 times higher, approximately equivalent to 250 micrograms per cubic meter of air, compared to a formula that's roughly equivalent to 100 micrograms per cubic meter of air for general industry. But the most important reason for the rule is that there is a great deal of evidence showing that the previous PELs do not adequately protect workers. It's been recognized for a very long time that exposure to respirable crystalline silica causes silicosis. But in recent decades, evidence has come to light showing that exposure to respirable crystalline silica also causes other diseases such as lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, including emphysema and chronic bronchitis, and kidney disease. And there is extensive evidence showing that these health effects occur at exposure levels even below the general industry limit of 100 micrograms per cubic meter of air. OSHA estimates that once the new rule is fully in effect, it will prevent more than 600 deaths per year and prevent more than 900 new silicosis cases per year. So we're looking at some very substantial benefits from the new rule. Now, in looking at the coverage of the rule, what we're talking about here is crystalline silica. And of course, there are forms of silica that are not crystalline, amorphous silica. But we do commonly see quartz and other forms of respirable crystalline silica in the construction industry when workers are working with brick, block, rock, concrete. And we're talking about respirable dust here, the very, very small particles that can penetrate deep into the lungs that are caused by those activities that fracture that crystalline silica. Things like chipping, cutting, sawing, drilling, grinding. You can see the individual here using a jackhammer. When you're breaking up rock, block, concrete, other materials that contain crystalline silica, you can easily have high respirable crystalline silica exposures. And there are also exposures that occur from a variety of general industry applications, things such as foundry work, glass manufacturing, sandblasting, other activities such as oil and gas work, where a lot of sand is used in hydraulic fracturing operations, is another area that's received a lot of attention recently. You can see a list here of some of the industries and operations with exposures. And as I mentioned, there are quite a few in general industry. But this is really largely a construction rule. The vast majority of workers and workplaces that are affected are in construction. We're looking at about 2.3 million workers who are exposed, and about 87% of those are in construction. And of the establishments affected, about 89% of those are in construction. So it's heavily focused on construction. That's where we see the majority of workers affected and the highest exposures. Now, OSHA has issued a respirable crystalline silica rule, but we have two separate standards. One is for general industry and maritime, and there's a separate standard for construction, and that's in order to focus the provisions of the standards on the industries affected. And there's one major difference between the two standards. We'll be focusing our discussion on construction, of course, today, but I'll point that out to you in just a moment. The standards are going to look very familiar to anyone who has looked at OSHA standards in the past. The structure and the content is very similar to other OSHA chemical-specific health standards, and there also is a great deal of similarity between the final standards that OSHA has for respirable crystalline silica and the ASTM consensus standards for respirable crystalline silica. You can see the structure of the construction standard here, and as I said, it looks very familiar to anyone who has looked at other OSHA chemical standards. And you can see highlighted here the big difference between the construction standard and the general industry standard that was just published. And it's the provision that addresses specified exposure control methods, where in the construction standard, we lay out the specified exposure control methods, often referred to as Table 1 because that's where they're presented in the standard. And employers have the alternative of either following those specified exposure control methods or following the alternative exposure control methods, which is the traditional approach that has been included in OSHA chemical standards, where a PEL is established and the employer simply needs to find a way to limit exposures to the PEL and needs to assess exposures in order to determine whether they are in compliance with that PEL. There's also a methods of compliance requirement that goes along with that. And we'll talk about each of these provisions here in a little more detail. First, the scope of the rule applies to operations in construction where there is exposure to respirable crystalline silica unless the exposure is going to remain below 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour time-weighted average under any foreseeable conditions. And what this is intended to do is to cover really any routine operations, routine performance of tasks that involve exposure to respirable crystalline silica. During the rulemaking, we heard from some parties who indicated that they may use tools and create respirable crystalline silica exposures, but it may only be for a few minutes a day. Plumbers, carpenters, electricians who may have to drill a hole or something of that nature as an incidental part of their job. And this is intended to accept those people from coverage under the standard. We also heard from some people who indicated that there were construction tasks that involved exposure, but the best evidence we had available to us indicated that there was either no exposure or very low exposure, things like pouring concrete or removing concrete forms. And the rule is not intended to cover them because the exposures are so low. These are not the people that we are worried about being at high risk of developing silica-related diseases. And the rule then focuses on those exposures that are higher. And really we're talking about anyone who's performing a task on Table 1, as you'll see listed later. And if they're doing that as a core part of their job, they're going to be covered by the rule in most circumstances. Now, I mentioned the specified exposure control methods in Table 1, and what that does is it matches 18 common construction tasks with effective dust control methods. In some cases, there are also respirator requirements that go along with those engineering and work practice controls. And if an employer fully and properly implements those controls, they don't need to comply with the PEL, they don't need to assess exposures. This is the route that we expect most construction employers to follow. It's the easy way for most employers to come into compliance. It's simple, it's straightforward. We had heard from the very beginning of the rulemaking that a lot of construction employers simply wanted to be told what they needed to do, not to be put in the position where they had to figure out what controls were effective. And what Table 1 does is lays out what those controls are so that they can be easily implemented. And you can see here an example of one of the entries on Table 1, in this case for stationary masonry saws. And what it does is it lays out the engineering and work practice control methods that would be used. In this case, using a saw equipped with a water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade, something that you commonly see on these saws anyway, and an expectation that that be operated and maintained in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Along with that, you see on the right-hand side, there are columns that lay out the respiratory protection requirements. And they are broken down by the duration that the task is performed, whether it's for less than or equal to 4 hours per shift or more than 4 hours per shift. In this case, if the engineering and work practice controls are implemented for stationary masonry saws, regardless of the duration the task is performed, no respirator would be required. You can see on the next entry another example for handheld power saws. And you can see how the table presents things differently in some circumstances, where in this case you're again looking at a water delivery system operated and maintained in accordance with manufacturer's instructions. And when that is used outdoors for less than 4 hours per shift, no respiratory protection would be required. But if it's operated outdoors for more than 4 hours per shift, or if it's used indoors for any duration of time, a respirator with an assigned protection factor of 10 would be required. And that could be simply a filtering facepiece respirator, an N95. And you can see here a list of the 18 Table 1 entries. And again, this is something that we anticipate is going to cover the vast majority of construction tasks that involve exposure to respirable crystalline silica. And when we talk about implementing the controls on Table 1, we use the term fully and properly implementing the controls. And what that means is that the controls need to be used in a manner that makes them effective. So, for example, if you're using a vacuum dust collection system on a grinder, you need to have the shroud intact such that it's capturing the dust. You need to empty the vacuum and change filters as necessary in order to ensure it's effective. You need to make sure that the hose is maintained, that they can deteriorate over time because silica is an abrasive, and make sure that that hose isn't tied in knots so that it's restricting the airflow. Really simple, practical things, the things you recognize that are necessary in order for these controls to be effective. We also refer to employees engaged in Table 1 tasks. And for most of these tasks, you're looking at tools that are operated by an individual tool operator. And of course, they are going to be considered to be engaged in the task. But there are going to be some circumstances where you're going to have other workers who would be considered to be engaged in the task. For example, you may have a walk-behind saw, and another worker would be needed in order to guide the operator such that they could follow the correct path. For jackhammers, it would be acceptable for someone to stand with the jackhammer operator and direct a hose on to the point where the jackhammer is breaking the crystalline silica containing material. If those people are involved in the task, they're considered to be engaged, and any respiratory protection requirements that would apply under Table 1 would also apply to that person who is helping or otherwise considered to be engaged in the task. But that engaged in the task does not mean anyone who happens to be in the vicinity of the task. There is another provision that we're going to talk about later that gets at restricting access, and it is intended to protect those people who are in the vicinity. Now, there are some respiratory protection requirements on Table 1. For the majority of entries on Table 1, there is no respiratory protection requirement, but in some circumstances where exposures above the permissible exposure limit are likely to persist, even with the implementation of the engineering and work practice controls, there is a requirement to use respiratory protection as well. And there are provisions in the rule that address issues where, for example, an employee may be performing multiple tasks on Table 1 during the course of the day. Now, if an employer does not fully and properly implement the controls on Table 1, they would be looking at the alternative exposure control methods, and that would involve complying with a new permissible exposure limit of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour time-weighted average. There's also a new action level of 25 micrograms per cubic meter of air as an 8-hour time-weighted average. And employers who follow the alternative are required to assess employee exposures to respirable crystalline silica. Anytime those exposures may reasonably be expected to exceed the action level. And there are two different options that the employer can follow for assessing exposures, a performance option and a scheduled monitoring option. Now, the performance option is very performance-oriented, as you would expect, and really opens up the opportunity for the employer to use a variety of methods to assess exposure. It must be sufficiently accurate, though, to characterize employee exposure. It can involve air monitoring data or objective data. And when we talk about objective data, that can mean a number of things. It can be data from industry-wide surveys. It can be other data. For example, it is possible to measure respirable dust exposures instantaneously. At this point, there isn't a method available to measure respirable crystalline silica exposures, although there is a method in the works. But at this point, an employer could use a instantaneous respirable dust monitor and either assume that all of the respirable dust is crystalline silica or otherwise characterize the crystalline silica content of the dust and use that as a basis for characterizing employee exposures. You can also look at that industry-wide data to gather data on particular tasks and particular circumstances and use that to characterize exposures. However, it must reflect the workplace conditions in that particular workplace, looking at the processes, types of material, control methods, work practices, and environmental conditions. There is also the scheduled monitoring option, and this is an approach that has been included in all of OSHA's previous chemical standards. And what it does is lays out a tiered schedule for monitoring exposures, and monitoring is required based upon the results of previous monitoring. So if initial results indicate exposures are below the action level, no additional monitoring would be required. If the most recent exposure monitoring results indicate exposures above the action level, additional monitoring would be required within 6 months. And if the exposure monitoring indicates exposures above the PEL, it must be repeated within 3 months. And that's really the simple structured approach to exposure monitoring if someone doesn't want to expend the effort or doesn't have the expertise to apply the performance approach. There's also a requirement that employers who monitor employee exposures to respirable crystalline silica have those samples analyzed in accordance with certain procedures that are laid out in Appendix A to the standard. And that is simply looking at some quality control for that analysis of sampling. Really you're looking at going to accredited laboratories, and accredited laboratories are already going to be following those procedures. An employer would simply need to get some assurance from the laboratory that they're in compliance with Appendix A, and they would be good on that count. There is also a requirement when following the alternative to follow provisions for methods of compliance, what we commonly refer to as the hierarchy of controls, where engineering and work practice controls are required to limit exposures to the extent feasible before resorting to use of respiratory protection. And you can see some examples here of the types of engineering controls we're talking about under the rule. They generally fall into two categories, either wet methods or vacuum dust collection systems, but there is some isolation as well, some use of cabs for certain tasks. And you can see the obvious difference that you have when controls are used versus not used. In this case, using a handheld saw without any control and comparing that with use of water to control the dust, it's a world of difference between the two. You see the same thing with a vacuum dust collection system. In this case, using a grinder without engineering controls, and then with the vacuum dust collection system, you have the big cloud of dust without controls, and it disappears when you have the vacuum attached. And here's another example, a jackhammer, cloud of dust without the control. Applying a little bit of water kills that dust cloud, and you have a situation where the exposures are greatly reduced. Where respiratory protection is required under the standard, employers must also comply with OSHA's respiratory protection standard. And essentially, respirators are required where the employer is following Table 1 whenever Table 1 specifies respirator use, or when not following Table 1 in any instance where engineering and work practice controls are not limiting exposures to the PEL. There are also housekeeping requirements included in the standard, and that is because certain housekeeping methods can contribute substantially to worker exposures to respirable crystalline silica. And we're looking at dry sweeping and dry brushing and use of compressed air. And there are some limitations that are imposed on dry sweeping and brushing and use of compressed air. We're really looking at use of any feasible alternatives like HEPA vacuuming or wet sweeping, or in the case of compressed air, if there is a ventilation system that is used to capture the dust cloud that's created by the compressed air. Dry sweeping or dry brushing or use of compressed air without that capture system would only be permitted if no other method is feasible. There is also a requirement for a written exposure control plan, and this is intended to assist employers with identifying those tasks that involve exposure to respirable crystalline silica and the appropriate controls, and also laying out the housekeeping measures that are going to be used to limit exposures. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a requirement for procedures here to restrict access when necessary to limit exposures. And this is getting at the issue with those workers who are in the vicinity of the task that is causing the respirable crystalline silica exposure. What we're looking at here is to avoid situations where workers are unprotected and working adjacent to those workers who are required to wear respiratory protection, where there's the high exposure. It's really just a common sense thing where you wouldn't put someone without respiratory protection next to someone who is required to use respiratory protection. So we're looking at the written exposure control plan to lay out procedures for restricting access in those situations and preventing those bystander exposures. There is also a requirement for a competent person to oversee and implement the provisions of the written exposure control plan. A competent person is simply a person who is capable of identifying those respirable crystalline silica hazards and is able to take prompt corrective measures to control the hazards. And they need to make frequent and regular inspections of the job site as necessary in order to ensure that those provisions are implemented. There is a requirement that employers offer medical exams to highly exposed workers. We're talking about construction workers who are going to be required to wear a respirator under the standard for 30 or more days per year. And exams must be offered initially and at least every 3 years. And there are requirements in the standard for what the medical exams must contain. In this case, medical and work history, a physical exam, chest x-ray, and a pulmonary function test, and on the initial exam, a TB test as well. Now, OSHA did something a little bit different with the final rule here when compared to our previous standards. In this standard, there is a requirement for the physician or other healthcare professional who administers the exam to provide a report to the worker, and that report contains detailed medical information, any recommended work restrictions, any recommendation for referral to a specialist, as well as any restrictions on respirator use. Now, the employer only receives an opinion that describes the limitations on respirator use. The additional information, recommended limitations on exposure to respirable, crystalline, silica, or the referral to a specialist is only included if the worker provides written consent. And that's because we heard from a number of organizations, healthcare and public health advocates, but especially from workers themselves, that they were not participate in the medical surveillance if that information was going directly to the employer, because they feared discrimination or retaliation if that information was shared. The standard includes requirements for hazard communication, reiterating some of the current requirements of our hazard communication standard, and emphasizing that that must address the health effects that are associated with exposure to respirable, crystalline, silica, but also some additional requirements getting at the requirements of the standard itself, and particularly the medical surveillance that's required under the standard. And there are record-keeping requirements as well for the air monitoring data or objective data in those cases where employers are following the alternative and assessing exposures, and for the medical records that are developed under the standard. Now, employers must comply with requirements of the standard by June 23rd of 2017, so we have a bit more than a year before most provisions of the standard kick in. But there is additional time for the requirement that samples be analyzed by labs that are in compliance with Appendix A of the standard. And OSHA is working on a number of guidance and outreach materials. We've already made a number of these available on our website. The Silica rulemaking webpage is our hub for providing this information, and we've got a number of fact sheets available, including a fact sheet on the construction standard, some frequently asked questions and answers to those. We've got videos. There is an appendix to the standard that provides information for the healthcare professionals who are administering medical exams under the standard. And we are also working on a small entity compliance guide, two actually, one for general industry and one specifically for construction, and we anticipate that those will be available by the end of June. That web page is the primary place to go to find the materials that OSHA is developing for compliance assistance. And I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the small entity compliance guide, because that's going to be, I think, the primary tool that we're going to have available to help employers understand and comply with the rule. And we'll be looking at really distilling the very lengthy discussion that was presented in the preamble to the final rule into a much more manageable document and a much more reader-friendly document that gets at the expectations under the rule for the various provisions of the standard. And we are also looking at developing in the future and prior to the compliance dates for the construction standard some additional materials that employers will be able to use to provide training to employees, getting at some of the generic training requirements that are included in the standard, such as those that address the health effects that are associated with respirable crystalline silica or the provisions of the rule. And also looking to develop some materials that would be focused on the workers who are exposed so that they understand the hazards and have information on the requirements of the rule. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eileen to talk about the Silica Safe online tool.
Oh, thanks, David. My name's Eileen Betit, and I'm the Director of Research to Practice. And today I'm going to just quickly go over certain sections of the website and really focus in on our Create a Plan section. We developed this site as a one-stop resource for workers and contractors to easily find information about the hazard and controls. Starting with the topics in the navigation bar, we have an About, which just gives a little background on how we developed this site. The Regulations and Requirements section contains information on the new standard, the regulatory history, and voluntary standards and other requirements that have been in effect. What's New has links to recent articles, new research, and a quick way to identify recent additions to this website, so you don't have to search through and see what's been added lately. And the Know the Hazard section, which is also a central feature, includes information on the risk, who's at risk, the health effects, and actions contractors and workers can take to work safely. The site also includes a training section where you can find training manuals and guides, presentations, toolbox talks in English and Spanish, videos, and handouts, including a pocket-sized hazard alert card that we're updating to reflect the new standard, and we're going to be printing it in both Spanish and English. The What's Working section has examples of tasks being performed with and without controls, as well as space to share information about successes and challenges encountered. And the Ask a Question section includes responses to frequently asked questions, as well as space to submit new questions. The other central feature is this free Create a Plan tool, which is designed to provide you with information on equipment and control options for silica generating tasks and ready access to commercially available examples. The flexibility to easily tailor and modify plans for individual projects, and the ability to share a plan electronically or as a hard copy with others, including OSHA representatives, employees, and other contractors on multi-employer work sites. As you'll see, this tool includes features that can help contractors develop the written exposure control plan that David just talked about, which is under paragraph G of the new standard. So when you enter the Create a Plan website, there are a few things I want to point out. The first is at the top there's an option to register. You don't have to register to use this tool, but those who do will be able to save their plans in a confidential, password-protected file and go back and modify a plan for future projects. We heard from contractors that oftentimes projects are very similar and they just need to make some minor modifications, so we added this feature. Next, there's a box a user can click on to see a quick summary of how the overall planning tool works. And throughout the site, there are areas where you can click to find additional information and resources for a specific topic or feature of this planning tool. And where appropriate, the information has been or we're in the process of updating it to reflect the language in the new standard and new compliance information that OSHA puts out. So let's focus on step one. This asks, will you generate dust containing silica on the job, and list common building materials that you can select from. If you aren't sure if a material contains silica, there's a link on the bottom of the screen that offers 4 options for finding out. Option 1 is checking the label. Option 2 says to check the safety data sheet. And if you click on any of the Learn Mores, for example, with the Check the Safety Data Sheet, there's information on how to find safety data sheets and what to look for on them. Option 3 is to review the published data, and this lists examples of the silica content of some common building materials. And option 4, analyze a sample of the material, explains how you'd go about finding a qualified lab to do this kind of analysis for you, the questions you should ask, and the type of information you should receive back. So you're in table step 1, and at this point, once you've determined if a material contains silica, you can either select it from the list or fill in one of your own. And as you select materials, a list of dust-generating tasks will appear, and you can select the appropriate task for each material that you've selected. And since many jobs, or oftentimes a job may involve more than one type of material and task, on this step you can select as many combinations as are appropriate for your job. So in this example, for brick we just selected one task, but for rock we've selected 2 different tasks. And once the material and the tasks are selected, the Continue button on the bottom of the screen will turn green, and you can move on to step 2. So in step 2 is automatically populated with the materials and the tasks that you selected in step 1. You can see those there numbered in little red boxes. And this step asks you, how do you plan to control the dust? And if you aren't sure, you would click on the link up at the top where it says define the exposure control methods in OSHA's silica standard, et cetera, and you'll see the click here. And that brings up a pop-up box which gives you 4 different options for figuring out how to control the dust. And the first one, option 1, contains the exposure control methods in the new standard and a link to the standard. Option 2 explains how to find a qualified person to perform air monitoring. Again, the questions you should ask as well as some sources for these individuals. Option 3 provides access to research that's been conducted on silica exposure and controls. And option 4 explains how to take advantage of OSHA's on-site consultation program. Or you can select from the list of generic equipment control options listed under each material and task combination, or you can enter one of your own. And above each list of options, there's a sentence that reads, click here for examples of commercially available equipment and controls. And if you click on that link, it'll take you to the examples for various manufacturers. It'll also have information on the equipment, how the equipment and control combinations work, including videos if they're available, and additional information on the specific types of equipment control option from other sources such as NIOSH or our Solutions Database project. We're in the process of updating this section to reflect the respiratory protection requirements in the standard. There's also space to enter a description of how the controls will be used to limit exposure on the job. So these first 2 steps can help you address the first 2 requirements for a written exposure control plan in the standard. And once the equipment and control methods are selected, you can then click on the green complete button at the bottom of the screen to move on to step 3. So step 3 is the final step in developing your written exposure control plan. And all of the selections that you made in steps 1 and 2 automatically are populated on this page. And you can see them. They're under the section Exposure Assessment and Control, and I just filled in some generic information just so you could see how it might appear. The rest of step 3 includes space for items required by the standard to be included in the plan, and space for other information that you might want to consider including. There's space at the top for the company name, the name and title of the person creating the plan, the job site or project it's for, and a description of the work that will be performed. There's space to include a competent person who, as David mentioned, under the new standard is required to implement the plan, and a link to a description of the competent person's role. There's space to enter information on how access will be restricted. David just talked about that, if necessary to limit exposures. And as OSHA develops new information on this, we'll update this section, so you'll be able to quickly reference or link to what OSHA has come up with. There's space to describe the training that will be provided to the employer. There's also space to describe housekeeping measures There's space to describe medical surveillance. And for all of those, you'll see there's a click here where if you go to it, you'll find related information from the current standard or additional information that we felt might be helpful for you to have as background in completing this plan. And finally, there's space for just other information that you feel would be helpful to have in your plan for the job that you're working on. So once you've filled out your plan, and you can complete this step at any time. You don't have to fill in every section. So you would hit the Continue button, and that would take you to a completed written exposure control plan. And this slide, I've had to split it into the plan into two parts just so it can fit on this PowerPoint screen. But at each step, you could, if you got to this point and felt that you needed to go back and edit something, you could go back to step 1 and make an edit. You could go back anywhere in your plan and make an edit at this point. If you had registered, you'd be able to save your plan for future editing or future use at this point. If you hadn't registered, you'd still be able to print out a hard copy of your plan, email your plan to other people, or download it and save it as a PDF. So in 3 steps, and at no cost, you can create a written exposure control plan for Silica using this. So that's it. Chris, I'll turn things back to you.
All right, thanks, Eileen. So now we'd like to open it up for questions and answers, and we really do have a nice list of questions that I'll go through. I think primarily David will be the one responding to them, but if you do have more questions, go ahead, type them in the